Once the dust settled after Commonwealth's suicidal attack on Billion homeworld of Voice, the General Staff decided to call all remaining officers, as well as private military contractors and civilian theorists, and form a committee that would take a long, critical look at humanity's ground forces and look for ways they could be improved, so that the tragedy like the one on Voice would never happen again. The committee gathered for the first session in November 2291, and after a few hours of discussion it became obvious that its members would have far more work than any of them anticipated. For although Commonwealth armies managed to win all the wars they took part in up until now, it was obvious that the losses they took during all conflicts were not even close to acceptable. And though they could have simply been attributed to numbers, fanaticism or ferocity of hostile forces, the truth was that, in its constant pursuit of new inventions, Commonwealth's weaponry far outpaced military tactics and strategies, leading to situations similar to ones back on Earth in wars where machine guns were used for the first time. As such, the first order of business for the committee was to take a look at humanity's arsenal, to identify its strong and weak points, and then, only then, with that knowledge in mind, begin to devise new ways of ground warfare. The first object on the table was of course the mainstay weapon of Commonwealth infantry, an AL-58 laser rifle. Devised by Ilmarinen Industries in 2257 and put into mass production a year later, this simple, reliable UV laser rifle quickly became the most common weapon of humanity and its allies. The weapon was powered by a micro-generator that enabled it to fire 20 bolts of energy in quick burst before 3-second recharge. Alternatively, a semi-auto mode could be triggered, in which each pull of the trigger produced a single bolt, which reduced rate of fire, but on the other hand allowed the use of the weapon without the need to recharge, which in turn meant that, especially when used by massed infantry, AL-58 could produce never-ending barrage of fire, something that could suppress all but the most foolhardy enemies. And finally, the weapon could be put in beam mode, in which every pull of the trigger produced a 1.7 second long cutting laser beam, similar to ones used on spaceships, although on a much smaller scale. The weapon had to recharge after such attack for another 3 seconds, but the end result was often worth it, for against unshielded enemies, such attack was often enough to slice away limbs or cut enemy armor to pieces. And finally, because it's an energy weapon, it doesn't suffer from spread. Once you point your sights at the target, you're going to hit. So, between its firing options, long effective range, a lack of need for ammunition and overall reliability, AL-58 is a very easy weapon to use, perfect for conscripts and trained soldiers alike. There is also another version of the rifle designed to use in zero gravity. The space version, AL-58-0, is mostly used by Deca Marines and, unlike regular model, actually requires frequent reloading, though not of ammunition but heat sinks, since the weapon has no means of cooling itself in vacuum of space. Second weapon on the board was a railgun that human engineers devised jointly with their Aramathi colleagues from Tintragal Arsenal, RG-66. This gun operates on the exact same rules as massive space railguns, with 2 magnetized rails propelling the projectile towards its target. And, like its larger cousins, RG-66 is also a semi-automatic weapon, since the rails can only charge 1 round at a time. It also has a relatively small magazine, only 8 bullets, but it more than makes up for it with raw kinetic firepower. Once it overloads personal shields on enemy target, each shot from RG-66 is either lethal or crippling one, because its 10mm rounds fired at 2.5 km per second have enough kinetic energy to pierce through nearly any personal armor, be it regular or powered one. And even if the target survives such a hit, the impact energy itself will usually throw them backwards with enough force to shatter every single bone within their body. As such, personal or stationary energy shields are the only means of protection against RG-66, because more often than not, it can smash through any cover available on the battlefield. All that, however, means that this weapon has no place in environments with little or no gravity, as its recoil would be just as deadly for the shooter as for their target. Finally came a device that was just as effective as it was controversial, Ember Mark III Plasma Bolter, built by Kithri military engineer by the name of Hiraj Aftrige. This weapon is technically a flamethrower, but instead of launching a steady stream of fire, it fires bolts of superheated plasma at a distance up to 800 meters. The weapon is fueled by a canister that provides it with enough power for 20 shots, but each one of them builds up such amounts of heat that the weapon can only be fired once every 8 seconds. Otherwise, its user risks disappearing in an explosion that can melt titanium plates on the spot. Still, a single shot from this weapon is often enough to eliminate most targets. Even if Plasma Bolt is stopped by an energy shield, its temperature is so high that simply being in close proximity to it can cause severe burns. Once personal shield is gone, however, no amount of armor can save the target. The bolt will simply melt through it, turning any enemy into slag within seconds. And against target devoid of any protection, a single attack is often enough to completely vaporize them. So, while effective, this weapon is often a center of heated controversy, as the collateral damage it causes is simply too unpredictable and dangerous, not to mention that it becomes a deadly threat to any civilians trapped in the combat zone. Now, these three weapons are not only used by foot soldiers. Aside from regular volunteer infantrymen who form the core of Commonwealth armies, ground troops were also supported by battalions of clone soldiers and battle droids. Clones are, for all intents and purposes, treated like regular troops, only slightly more reliable and skilled ones, since they devote their entire lives to military matters. Droids, on the other hand, are a bit more complicated. The most common model, Raywater 2, is a walking weapons platform that stands nearly 2 meters tall and is, to frequent dismay of regular troops, almost completely autonomous. The reason for that is that these machines are most often used as a vanguard, thrown against enemy formations at the very beginning of every battle to reduce their numbers and make way for regular troops. And these charges, that would often be suicidal for common infantrymen, is precisely what Raywaters specialize at. Armed with heavier versions of regular infantry weapons, covered in heavy durantium plate armor and protected by high-powered shield generators, these battle droids rush entrenched enemy positions, ignoring incoming fire and their own casualties, pushing relentlessly forward no matter the odds. And in order to support their advance, they are also equipped with medium-range mortars that can lob specialized grenades up to 300 meters. Normally, they use regular explosive ones, but depending on the situation, they can be outfitted with incendiary, EMP, smoke, or even stun grenades, these last ones used especially in situations when Commonwealth needs to capture some enemies alive to gather intelligence. Unfortunately though, while these battle droids are perfect shock troopers, their programming is not flawless, and sometimes they can be found engaging empty space or firing repeatedly into fallen enemies. Most importantly though, they tend to have issues when it comes to discerning between soldiers and non-combatants, bad news for any civilians stuck on the battlefield. It was at this point, during examination of Raywater droids and their performance on the battlefield, when the committee realized the main problem: the huge difference between offensive and defensive capabilities of Commonwealth armies. While droids were relatively well protected, resilient and basically immune to all non-lethal attacks, regular troops were far less lucky. Though protected by durantium armor under their uniforms and personal shield generators in their backpacks, common soldiers simply lacked defenses needed on the modern battlefield. For, as was mentioned, their armor was near useless against railguns and plasma weapons, while their shields could easily be overloaded with sustained laser fire. General Staff tried to counteract that by fielding specialized engineers with deployable shield generators, far more powerful than regular ones, but that solution was only moderately useful, as it provided increased survivability at the expense of mobility. In short, humanity's armies were glass cannons, able to deal devastating damage to their enemies, but also suffering heavy casualties in return. Soon, the committee realized that only technological advantage of the Commonwealth allowed its troops to gain as many victories up until now, for if an enemy, like for example Kingdom of Yadra, possessed the same weapons as the Commonwealth, the invasions of their planet would have gone far worse. So, the first major flaw has been identified: the lack of proper defensive systems. But the committee was not done yet. During its next meetings, its members would take a look at the more specialized troops within Commonwealth's military, as well as dismantle the command structure and combat theory that remained practically unchanged for almost 300 years.